There is a moment, and if you have ever loved someone deeply and lost them, you will understand this. There is a moment where the world you thought you lived in simply stops making sense. Not slowly, not gradually, all at once, like a door slamming shut in a room you thought was yours. For Richard Calloway, that moment came on a cold November evening in 2023, when he pushed open the front door of the mansion he had abandoned 30 years earlier and felt the air shift in a way that told him, before his eyes could confirm it, that he was not alone. He had driven 4 hours to see the property one final time before selling it. He had not told anyone he was coming. There were no cars in the driveway, no lights from the road. And yet, as he stepped into the front hallway and his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw what no man who had buried his wife and stood at her graveside and wept, or tried to weep, should ever have to see. A light, coming from upstairs, and behind it, the unmistakable silhouette of a woman who had been dead for 30 years. Before we go any deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, before we tell you how this story ends, we need to go back to the beginning. Because nothing about what happened in that mansion on a November night in 2023 makes any sense unless you understand who Richard Calloway was, who Eleanor Calloway was, and what had taken place between them in the years before her death was announced, mourned, and quietly accepted by everyone who thought they knew the truth. There are 3 questions at the center of this story, and we are going to answer every single one of them. The first is this: how does a woman disappear so completely, so convincingly, that even the people who loved her believe she is gone? The second question is harder. What did Richard Calloway do that made a woman choose a ghost's existence over the life she had built? And the third question, the one that will stay with you long after this video ends, is one that Eleanor herself asked Richard the night he walked back through that door. She looked at him across 30 years of silence, and she said, quietly and without any anger at all, "Did you ever, even once, wonder if I was still out there?" We are going to let Richard's answer speak for itself. But we warn you now, it is not the answer you are hoping for. Richard Calloway was born in 1952 in Dayton, Ohio, the second of 3 sons raised by a father who worked at a machine parts factory and a mother who kept the household together on very little and never once complained about it. He was not the kind of child people wrote stories about. He was not particularly gifted in school, not particularly popular, not the boy that teachers remembered 20 years later. What Richard had, from a very young age, was something that is almost impossible to teach and very difficult to contain: an absolute, unshakable refusal to remain where he had started. By the time he was 19, he had saved enough from 2 part-time jobs to take a real estate licensing course. By 23, he had closed his first commercial deal, a strip of undeveloped land outside of Columbus that he purchased for $12,000 and resold 14 months later for $61,000. By 27, he was doing deals that required lawyers he had never needed before, contracts with terms he had to stay up until 2 in the morning to understand, and shaking hands with men who had gone to schools he had never been invited to attend. Richard Calloway built himself from almost nothing. And if that sounds like the beginning of an admirable story, it is, but only the beginning. The problem with men who build themselves entirely from will and hunger is that they often apply the same philosophy to the people around them. People, in Richard's mental framework, were either useful or they were not. Relationships were either assets or they were liabilities. Emotions were things that other people had, things that slowed you down, clouded your judgment, and cost you deals you could have won if you had just stayed cold. He was not cruel in the ways that announced themselves. He was not the kind of man who raised his voice in restaurants or made scenes in front of colleagues. Richard Calloway's particular brand of damage was quieter than that, and far more precise, and it took Eleanor Mercer, who became Eleanor Calloway on a warm Saturday in June of 1981, far longer than it should have to understand what she was living inside. Eleanor Mercer grew up in Worthington, Ohio, 20 minutes outside Columbus, in a house that was always slightly too loud and never quite large enough, and absolutely full of love. Her mother taught 3rd grade for 31 years. Her father repaired small engines out of the garage and coached Little League on Saturday mornings. Eleanor was the oldest of 4 children, and she grew up with a bone-deep understanding of what it felt like to be seen and heard and valued, because that was simply the water she had swum in from the beginning. She studied fine arts at Ohio State and then spent 3 years teaching elementary art classes at a community center in Columbus while she painted in her apartment on weekends. Large, color-saturated canvases that a local gallery showed twice before she decided the gallery owner was more interested in her attention than her work. She had a wide circle of friends, a best friend named Patricia whom she had known since the 7th grade, and a laugh that people remembered. She was 30 years old when she met Richard at a charity gala organized by a Columbus area hospital foundation, and she was struck by him immediately, by his directness, his confidence, the way he spoke as though he had already decided how every room he entered was going to arrange itself around him. Her friend Patricia, who was standing beside her that night, said years later that she watched Eleanor's face when Richard walked over and introduced himself and felt a chill she could not explain at the time, but understood perfectly well in the years that followed. They dated for 11 months. Richard was attentive in the way that men who have decided they want something can be, focused, present, generous with his time in a way that would later seem impossible to reconcile with who he became once the decision had been made and the ring was on her finger. He took her to restaurants that required reservations made weeks in advance. He remembered details she mentioned in passing and brought them back in ways that felt thoughtful. He told her she was extraordinary. He told her he had never met anyone like her. And Eleanor, who had grown up being genuinely loved, and so had no reason to suspect that love could be performed with this level of precision and this little actual feeling behind it, believed him completely. Patricia had reservations. Patricia always had reservations. But Eleanor was 30 and in love, and the wedding was beautiful, and the estate outside Columbus that Richard purchased for them in the fall of 1981 was the kind of home that makes you believe the life inside it will be as large and luminous as the rooms themselves. It was not. The change was not immediate. It never is in these stories, and we want to be very clear about that, because one of the most common and most damaging myths about the kind of marriage Eleanor found herself in is that the woman should have seen it coming sooner. She should not have. Richard was careful. The first time Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her, they had been married for about 8 months. She had mentioned, in passing, that she was thinking of resuming her art classes at the community center, part-time, just 2 mornings a week. Richard said nothing at the time. 3 days later, she arrived home to find that the large canvas she had been working on in the study had been moved. When she asked where it was, Richard said he had put it in the basement because a client was coming over and the study needed to look professional. He said it pleasantly. He said it as though it were completely reasonable. Eleanor retrieved the painting from the basement, and when she looked at it later that evening, she noticed that the corner of the canvas had been bent. She never mentioned it, but she remembered it. And the woman who had painted large, color-saturated canvases in her apartment in Columbus began, almost without realizing it, to make herself a little smaller. By the time their 3rd wedding anniversary arrived, Eleanor had stopped teaching the art classes. She had not made a conscious decision to stop. It had simply become too complicated, too many conversations about scheduling, too many quiet suggestions from Richard about how her time might be better spent, too many mornings when his mood at breakfast made her decide that today was not the day to bring up the community center again. Patricia noticed the change and said so, directly, the way only a friend of 20 years can. Eleanor told her she was exaggerating. The truth was that Eleanor was not yet ready to name what was happening to her, and there is nothing unusual about that. Experts who study coercive control in relationships have documented, in case after case, that the process by which a person loses themselves inside this kind of marriage is so gradual and so carefully managed that the person losing themselves is often the last one to understand what is actually occurring. By 1985, Richard had taken over the household accounts. By 1987, Eleanor's contact with her own family was limited to phone calls that Richard was usually present for and holiday visits that required a level of advanced planning that made spontaneity feel impossible. She was not locked in a room. She was not covered in bruises. She was simply, methodically, invisibly contained. And the container had been built so skillfully that from the outside it looked exactly like a life. In the spring of 1988, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. And for a window of time that she later described to Patricia as both the happiest and most frightening of her life, something in the dynamic between her and Richard genuinely shifted. He was attentive again, the way he had been when they were first together, before the decision had been made and the work of containing her had begun. He came home for dinner. He asked her how she was feeling. He put his hand on her shoulder in a way that did not feel like a gesture toward an audience. Eleanor allowed herself to believe that this was real. She allowed herself to believe that a child would do what nothing else had been able to do, which was to make Richard Calloway finally arrive at a version of himself that was capable of genuine connection. Patricia did not believe it. But Patricia, by this point, had learned which conversations Eleanor was and was not ready to have, and she held her tongue and hoped she was wrong. Daniel Richard Calloway was born on February 9, 1989, in a Columbus hospital, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's hands. Eleanor wept when she held him for the first time, not from exhaustion or relief, but from something closer to recognition, as though this small person was someone she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. Richard stood at the edge of the room and looked at his son and said, "He looks strong." It was the kindest thing he said in the hospital. Eleanor told herself it was enough. It was not enough. By the time Daniel was 3 months old, the window had closed again. Richard was traveling more than ever. The household ran on his schedule and his rules and his expectations, and Eleanor moved through it all with a kind of careful efficiency that looked, from a distance, like a woman who had found her place, and felt, from the inside, like a woman who was running out of air. And then, on a Tuesday morning in October of 1989, when Daniel was asleep in the nursery and Richard was supposed to be in Cleveland for a 2-day meeting, Eleanor went into Richard's study to find an envelope she had left on his desk, and she found something else. Something she was not meant to find. Something that she would never describe in full to another living soul for the rest of her life. Not to Patricia, not to the one attorney she consulted briefly in 1990, not to Daniel, even when he was grown. What Eleanor Calloway found in that study on a Tuesday morning in October of 1989 was the reason she stopped asking herself if things could get better and started asking herself a very different question. Not whether she could change Richard, not whether she could save the marriage, but whether she could get out, safely, completely, and in a way that Richard Calloway, with all of his resources and all of his calculation, would never be able to undo. It took her 3 years to build the plan. 3 years of appearing to accept what her life had become. 3 years of small and careful movements that Richard's attention, however controlling, never once landed on. She opened a bank account in the name of a woman who did not exist, using a process she had researched at the library on days when she took Daniel for his checkups at a pediatrician whose office was near enough to downtown Columbus that no one would question the length of the trip. She made contact with Patricia through handwritten notes left inside library books, an old game from their college years, leaving messages for each other tucked inside the back covers of novels they knew the other would eventually check out. Patricia did not ask for explanations. Patricia had been waiting for this conversation for years. Between them, over 3 years of notes in library books and 2 meetings that took place in the parking lot of a grocery store 20 miles from the estate, they built what Eleanor later called, in the one recorded conversation that exists about this period, the only exit I could find that he wouldn't be able to lock behind me. On the evening of January 14, 1993, Eleanor Calloway put Daniel, who was 4 years old, in the car under the explanation that they were going to see the ducks at the park before dinner. She drove to Millhaven Lake, which was 18 miles from the estate. She left the car at the water's edge, driver's door open, her coat folded on the passenger seat, her shoes placed. And this was deliberate. This was careful. This was 30-year-old Eleanor who had learned from living with Richard Calloway exactly how a detail could tell a story. Her shoes placed at the waterline, as though placed by a woman in a final, decided moment. Then she walked, with Daniel in her arms, 3 miles through a stretch of state forest to a road where Patricia was waiting in a car registered to a name that did not appear in any document connected to either of them. And just like that, Eleanor Calloway ceased to exist. Except that she did not cease to exist at all. The call came to the Calloway estate the following morning. A jogger had spotted the car, the shoes, the open door, the coat. Within 4 hours, Millhaven Lake was surrounded by county sheriff's vehicles, a dive team, and 2 boats. Richard Calloway was contacted at what would later be established, though never fully explained, as an address in Columbus that was not his office. He arrived at the lake in the early afternoon. He wore a dark jacket. He stood at the water's edge and looked out at the lake and said very little. The lead investigator on the case was a 20-year department veteran named Detective Warren Hargrove, and Hargrove later said in an interview that the first thing he noticed about Richard Calloway at that lakeside was not grief. It was calculation. He said, "I have stood with a lot of people who have just been told their wife may have drowned. There is a particular kind of shock that hits the body. The shoulders, the eyes, the hands. It looks a specific way. What I saw that afternoon did not look that way." Hargrove filed his observation in a notebook and kept it, but at that stage there was nothing actionable about the feeling in a detective's gut. The lake was searched for 11 days. No body was ever recovered. Eleanor Calloway was declared missing, and 14 months later, in the spring of 1994, she was declared legally dead. Richard did not contest the declaration. Hargrove was not satisfied. Over the months that followed Eleanor's official death declaration, he quietly pulled at threads that were not part of his assigned case. He looked at Richard's financials for the period before Eleanor's disappearance. He looked at travel records. He spoke, informally, to 3 people who had worked for Richard over the years and had subsequently left his employment in ways that were, in each case, described as the employee's decision and remembered by those employees with a kind of careful blankness that Hargrove had seen before in people who had been made to understand that certain things were not worth talking about. He found nothing that would have moved a prosecutor. What he found instead was an absence, an almost total lack of the kinds of traces that a real life, a genuinely lived marriage, leaves behind. No friends who could describe Richard and Eleanor together in an unguarded moment. No photographs that showed her relaxed. No stories that began with "Eleanor always said," or "Eleanor used to love." The people who knew Richard talked about Richard. Eleanor, in most of those accounts, was simply in the background, present, quiet, and somehow already gone before she was gone. Richard Calloway did not grieve publicly or at length. He commissioned a small memorial plaque that was installed in the garden of the estate, and within 18 months of Eleanor's death declaration, he had restructured 2 of his largest business holdings, acquired a commercial property portfolio in Cincinnati that his lawyers described as one of his most aggressive expansions to date, and quietly begun what would become a 7-year relationship with a woman named Sandra who moved into the estate in 1996 and moved out again in 2003 under circumstances that his people described as amicable, and that Sandra, in the one brief statement she gave to a local journalist years later, declined to characterize at all. Hargrove retired from the department in 2001. He took 1 box of files with him. He was not supposed to. He took it anyway. What nobody on the outside of the Calloway story knew, what nobody could have known, was that Eleanor and Daniel had not gone far at all. Patricia, who was by 1993 living in a house she had inherited from her grandmother 12 miles from the Calloway estate, had spent the preceding 2 years quietly preparing a section of the estate's own east wing for occupancy. This requires an explanation, and we want to give it carefully. The east wing of the Calloway estate had been damaged in a basement flood in 1991, and Richard, who found the wing architecturally uninspiring and had never been comfortable in it since his mother had died in one of its rooms in 1984, had ordered it boarded up and left. Eleanor knew this wing in the way that only a person who has spent years studying the house they are trapped in can know a room. She knew where the boards were held by a single nail on the inside. She knew which windows had frames that had swollen enough in the damp to seal from the inside without a latch. She knew which section of the service corridor was invisible from every external sight line on the property. She had been to that wing 37 times in the 2 years before her disappearance. She had counted. Patricia had helped her carry in, over a period of many months, and always in Daniel's nap times, the things they would need. It was not comfortable. It was not large. But it was inside the walls of a property that Richard Calloway had already emotionally and physically abandoned, and Eleanor had understood something about Richard that proved to be precisely correct, that a man who discards things rarely looks at them again. Inside that east wing, Eleanor began to make a life. Daniel was 4 years old and understood, with the particular seriousness of a small child who has been told the truth as gently as possible, that they were playing a very long and important game of hiding, and that the rules of the game were that they were very, very quiet during the days and careful always about lights after dark. Patricia brought supplies. A postal library system, access through a false name and a post office box in a town 30 miles away, meant that Eleanor could educate Daniel. She taught him to read with library books and to do mathematics with a notebook and a pencil and the kind of patient, unhurried attention that she had once given to the children in her art classes in Columbus. She taught him history and science, and when he was old enough to understand why it mattered, she taught him the truth about who his father was and what had happened and why they were living the way they were living. Daniel Calloway grew up inside a secret. But he grew up loved, which is not a small thing, and it may in fact be the most important thing in this entire story. For 30 years, this arrangement held. Richard never returned to the estate. He had moved his primary residence to Cincinnati after Sandra's departure and later to a property in Scottsdale, Arizona, which his associates described as his preferred base for the final decade of his business career. The Calloway estate outside Columbus was maintained on a skeleton staff arrangement that had, over the years, dwindled to a single property management account that sent a check twice a year and expected no interaction. The grounds were maintained by a landscaping company whose foreman had, in 2004, been quietly approached by a young man who identified himself as a caretaker and asked if the company would simply leave the East Wing area undisturbed. The foreman, who was not paid to ask questions and was getting his check reliably, agreed without discussion. That young man was Daniel. He was 15 years old, and he had already, by that age, become the person responsible for making sure that the life inside those walls continued to hold together. By the time Daniel was in his late 20s, he had established a careful, sustainable existence that involved leaving the estate grounds 2 or 3 times per week, always during the hours when the grounds crew was not present, always on foot for the first mile, always with the kind of awareness of his surroundings that a person develops not from training, but from a childhood spent understanding that visibility carries consequences. He had, under a name that Patricia had helped establish through documentation that we will not describe in detail, a library card, a small income from freelance drafting work he completed and submitted entirely online, and a bank account that paid the one active utility line on the estate's east wing, a single electrical connection running through an old contractor account that had never been formally closed. Eleanor, who was now in her early 60s, tended the enclosed courtyard garden that no one could see from the road and painted, every single day, on the walls of the East Wing. 30 years of painting, every room covered floor to ceiling. Murals that moved from room to room like chapters in a book that only 2 people had ever read. In September of 2023, Richard Calloway received a diagnosis that his cardiologist described as serious and his attorney described, in a call 3 days later, as requiring an immediate review of his estate planning. Richard was 71 years old. He had a heart condition that was manageable but progressive, and his doctor had been clear that the kind of stress associated with complex ongoing property management was not what his body needed for whatever time remained. He made a decision quickly, the way he had always made decisions, with very little visible emotion and a great deal of forward-facing practical planning. He would sell the Columbus estate. He wanted to walk through it once before the listing went live. He instructed his attorney to arrange access with the property management company and scheduled the visit for a Monday in November. He did not call ahead to the property management company directly. He did not give them a specific time of arrival. He simply drove. Daniel found out from a local news item on a Thursday, a brief mention in the Columbus business pages that Richard Calloway was liquidating his remaining Ohio holdings ahead of a move to a smaller property in Arizona. Eleanor read it twice. She sat with it for a long time. Then she stood up, went to the window of the room she had painted in blues and golds, looked out at the courtyard garden she had tended for 3 decades, and said something to Daniel that he has repeated in the one interview he has given since the events of November 2023. She said, "We always knew this day would come. I just didn't know it would feel this much like something ending and something beginning at the same time." Daniel asked her if she wanted to leave. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "No, let him come in. I have been waiting to ask him something for 30 years. Richard arrived at the estate on the evening of November 7th, 2023. He drove himself, which was unusual. He had told his attorney he wanted the walkthrough to be private. He parked in the circular driveway, tried the front door, which opened because Daniel had unlocked it that morning, and moved through the west wing with a flashlight, slowly, touching nothing. Then he stopped. At the entrance to the east wing, where the boards had been replaced so precisely that only someone who knew what they were looking for would notice they were not original to the wall, Richard Calloway stopped. The boards were gone. The doorway was open, and from somewhere beyond it came the faint, warm smell of something that took him 20 full seconds to identify. He identified it as oil paint. He went through. The murals stopped him completely. He stood in the hallway and turned slowly, and what he was looking at was 30 years of his wife's handwriting on the walls, notes and dates and small inscriptions in the margins of the paintings, the way a person signs a work they are proud of, and painted into the largest mural on the east wall of what had once been a storage room and was now, unmistakably, a living space, a family portrait. Eleanor, painted by herself in the particular careful way of a person who has had decades to perfect their own likeness. And beside her, a boy at every age from infancy to adulthood, painted in panels that moved across the wall like a timeline. The boy had Richard's eyes. Richard knew whose eyes those were because he saw them in his mirror every morning of his life. He was still standing there, unable to speak, when he heard a sound at the end of the hallway. He raised his flashlight. Eleanor Calloway was standing 30 feet away from him, white-haired and calm, with her hands at her sides and no expression on her face that he could read. Beside her stood a man in his mid-30s with his father's eyes and his mother's hands, and an expression that was not hostile and not warm but was, above everything else, completely steady. Richard's flashlight dropped slightly. He said the only word he was capable of in that moment. He said, "Eleanor." And Eleanor said, "Hello, Richard. I think it's time we finished a conversation we never actually started." What Eleanor Calloway said to Richard in that East Wing hallway over the next 2 hours was not recorded in its entirety. Daniel was present for all of it. He has spoken about it publicly only once, in a careful and limited way, and what he has described is less a confrontation than a reckoning. Two people at the end of a very long road, speaking plainly to each other for what was, in Eleanor's case, the first time, and in Richard's case, perhaps the only time. Eleanor told him what she had found in his study in October of 1989. She told him what it had meant, and what it had cost her to keep it, and why she had chosen to disappear into the walls of his own estate rather than run further. She had stayed, she told him, because the estate was not his. He had purchased it, yes. His name was on the deed. But she had lived inside it with more honesty and more intention than he had ever managed, and she had refused to allow him the satisfaction of a clean erasure. She had also stayed because she had the documents she had copied from his study, documents that described a land acquisition deal carried out in 1988 and 1989 that had resulted in 3 rural Ohio communities being systematically displaced through falsified environmental assessments and an arrangement with a county official that was, in straightforward terms, a bribe. Eleanor had kept copies of those documents in a waterproof case inside the East Wing for 30 years. She had never used them. She had simply held them, the way you hold something heavy when you are not yet sure what it is for. Richard's response to all of this has been described by Daniel as very quiet. Not the quiet of a man who is calculating. Daniel was clear about this distinction, but the quiet of a man who has just understood something about his own life that he should have understood a long time ago and did not. He did not threaten Eleanor. He did not reach for his phone. He did not speak for a long time. And when he finally did speak, what he said was not a defense or an explanation. What he said, according to Daniel, was, "I think I always knew you were smarter than me. I just couldn't afford to admit it." It was not an apology. Eleanor did not ask for one. What she asked for was a conversation with his attorney, to be arranged within 2 weeks, with Daniel present. Richard agreed. He left the estate that night and sat in his car in the driveway for 40 minutes before he drove away. The legal process that followed took the better part of 8 months. Eleanor's death certificate was contested and ultimately voided through a circuit court proceeding that drew a significant amount of quiet attention from both the legal community and the handful of journalists who were allowed limited access to the story during that period. The documents from Richard's study were turned over to the Ohio Attorney General's office in December of 2023. An investigation into the 1988 and 1989 land deals resulted in a federal civil proceeding against 2 former associates of Richard's and a financial settlement paid to the families of the 3 communities that had been displaced, a settlement that Richard funded voluntarily, in full, as part of an arrangement that kept him out of criminal proceedings. He was, by that point, too ill to survive. Richard Calloway died in January of 2025, 14 months after walking back through the door of the mansion he had abandoned. Eleanor was not at his bedside. Daniel was. He has not said what passed between them. He has only said that his father, at the end, asked him a question, and that he answered it honestly, and that it seemed to be enough. The Calloway estate did not sell. Through a legal arrangement finalized in the spring of 2024, Daniel was recognized as a legitimate heir and the property transferred into a family trust in his name. Eleanor continues to live in the East Wing, by choice, still by choice, though the boards are gone now and the doors are open and she comes and goes as she pleases. She opened the wing to visitors once a month beginning in the fall of 2024, a private gallery, by appointment, no charge. The murals she painted over 30 years have been documented by an Ohio State art historian who described them as one of the most extraordinary private works she had encountered in her career. Eleanor has given 2 interviews. In both of them, she has been asked the same question, which is whether she has any regrets about the 30 years she spent inside those walls. Her answer, both times, has been the same. She says, "I raised my son. I made my work. I kept my word to myself. Regret is for people who didn't choose. I chose." What this story leaves you with, and we have thought about this for a long time, is not a simple lesson. It is not a neat takeaway that fits on a screen or inside a caption. It is something older and heavier and more complicated than that. It is the knowledge that control, when it is applied to a person who has a deep enough sense of their own worth, does not always produce the outcome the person exerting it expects. Richard Calloway spent 40 years believing that he had made Eleanor smaller, made her more manageable, made her into something he could contain. What he had actually done was drive her into a wall of his own house, where she had built a life that was quieter than his and slower than his and invisible to the world. But that was, in every way that actually counts, larger than anything Richard Calloway had ever made. The mansion was always hers. She just had to wait long enough for him to figure that out. We want to ask you something, and we genuinely want you to answer in the comments, because there is no right answer to this, and we mean that. Eleanor had those documents for 30 years. She could have used them at any point. She could have walked into a prosecutor's office in 1993, in 1999, in 2007, at any moment in 3 decades. She waited until Richard came back to her. Was that patience? Was that strategy? Was it something closer to mercy, giving a man the chance to see, with his own eyes, what he had thrown away? Or was it the thing that none of us want to say out loud, which is that it was the only kind of power Eleanor had ever been allowed to hold, and she held it for as long as it took to mean something? Tell us what you think. We are reading every single comment. Before we close out today, we want to take a moment to thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. Stories like Eleanor's are not easy to sit with. They ask something of you. They ask you to hold complexity and contradiction at the same time, to understand how a person can be a survivor and a strategist and a mother and an artist and someone who was deeply, profoundly wronged, all at once, without reducing any of those things to fit a simpler narrative. That is what we try to do on this channel. Not to simplify, not to tie things up in ways that feel satisfying but are not actually true, but to sit with stories the way you would sit with a person all the way through without rushing to the end. If that is the kind of storytelling you come here for, then hit the subscribe button right now, because what we have coming up next is a story that has taken us 3 months to research and that we have not been able to stop thinking about since the day we first encountered it. A woman in rural Tennessee receives a letter from her husband on the morning of his funeral. A letter he could not have written, postmarked 3 days after the date of his death. And what that letter contains does not explain the impossibility of its existence. It deepens it. That story is coming very soon. We will see you there.